it's really a book that there were a lot of people who, when they looked at the proposal, were like, can't we just tell the story of women's sports through like a single narrative, like one plucky gal who, beat the odds, that kind of thing. And there are lots of stories like that, and they're really important stories. But I felt like I really wanted to tell a story that was more complete, that had the current moment in women's sports and what's happening and the enthusiasm and the profound change that we're witnessing right now. But that also tells the story of the historic reluctance to allow women to play, to platform women's sports, and to cover women's sports, which I've had a bit of a front row seat to. So this is a pretty complicated story. Like, it's not a single person narrative. It's not a story that's geared toward middle schoolers designed to inspire girls to play sport. I think there are a lot of books like that. So I wanted this to be different.
She is the author of The Fast Track, Inside the Surging Business of Women's Sports. We welcome back Jane McManus onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Jane.
Hi, happy to be here again.
Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Excited to delve into this book. I find women's sports to be really fascinating. Of course, this podcast about basketball, but I follow all sports. So, and the business of sports. So, especially the rise of just a lot of new leagues and a lot of them surrounding just women's sports, I find just truly fascinating. So, this book is fantastic. I always like to delve into the creative process. So, can you walk our viewers and listeners into the creative process of this book?
Yeah. So, this felt to me like a book I had to write. I've never written a book before. I had a blend of kind of hubris and naivete, I think, that helps, get you through a process like this. I thought, well, I'm a writer. I know how to write. How hard can it be to write a book? And made the proposal kind of with that, in that spirit. And it's hard to write a book. So I know that everyone who's written a book says this. Somehow I didn't believe it to be the case. I thought I'd be the exception. I'm not the exception. Um, but it's really a book that there were a lot of people who, when they looked at the proposal, were like, can't we just tell the story of women's sports through like a single narrative, like one plucky gal who, you know, beat the odds, that kind of thing. And there are lots of stories like that, and they're really important stories. But I felt like I really wanted to tell a story that was more complete, that had the current moment in women's sports and what's happening and the enthusiasm and the profound change that we're witnessing right now. But that also tells the story of the historic reluctance to allow women to play, to platform women's sports, and to cover women's sports, which I've had a bit of a front row seat to. So this is a pretty complicated story. Like, it's not a single person narrative. It's not a story that's geared toward middle schoolers designed to inspire girls to play sport. I think there are a lot of books like that. So I wanted this to be different. And so what I did was Julie DeCaro and I did a podcast called The Ladies Room for Deadspin for a couple years during the pandemic. And so we talked to people like Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe and Stacey Allister, and people kind of had that front row seat to what was happening in women's sports specifically. And so I took some of that of course had kind of been seeding some of these ideas for me, also my experience at ESPN. And then I went and I talked to probably another 75 people who are involved in the business of women's sports, and like Jessica Berman and Kathy Engelbert and Nadia Rawlinson and as many people as I could find who even I was at a Liberty game, and there was this guy who was walking like on the right up courtside to his seat, and I was like, that guy's somebody. So I went over and I just started a conversation with him, and he's a really interesting person. He ends up leading one of my chapters. He was a season ticket holder for the Sky, but was such a big Courtney Vandersloot fan that when she went to New York, he got courtside seats for the Knicks season, or I'm sorry, for the Liberty season as well. So like, somebody you need those kinds of fans who are super passionate. And he told me his story and how he got into women's sports. And so that was somebody that I ended up leading with. So I've got a lot of people in there and personalities and telling stories around how things happen, and that kind of lead us into the bigger view as well. So I start from the micro, from the individuals, and then I kind of go to how does this fit in a historical context and in the moment where we're living.
With that fan and his origin and getting into women's sports, do you find those stories are different compared to getting into men's sports? Is it like a different kind of dichotomy there, you think, in just your experience?
Like fans aren't a monolith, so
Sure.
it's hard to kind of like say exactly what that thread is that makes it a little bit different. I mean, I think historically, you know, people who like product, like if you like the NFL and you want to be a season ticket holder, you've got a lot of competition. That's a big fan base. But sometimes people want to zag, like they want to kind of follow their own beat. And and this was definitely somebody who was in that category. And he just kind of followed what his interest was. And I do think that there's that people who have been longtime fans of women's sports have often have not been going in concert with that monoculture, that mono sporting culture. They so that would be what I would say is a different, but I think, you think about like Spike Lee here in New York, we think about Spike Lee and the Knicks and, having that kind of like that iconic mega fan who is like somebody who drives interest, drives conversation. He's passionate. He kind of like expresses the passion of the everyday fan. But he's also somebody who has a really interesting story to tell. And I just think like the fans of, women's leagues need those fans, right? Like, and not just like the famous ones, but like the everyday one who's like, oh, is it a Tuesday? It's game night, that kind of thing. And I think those fans, they've always been there, but I think they're starting to really increase in number.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is the last, I would say, 15 years or so, there's been an explosion of a lot of newer leagues pertaining around women's sports compared to, I'm a millennial, so I grew up primarily in the 90s. So, I think this last 15 years compared to the 90s, a lot more leagues surrounding women's sport. Is that accurate, you think, in terms of that explosion? And if it is, what do you attribute to that growth?
Well, I think it's because there's a demonstrable market, right? There's demonstrable return on investment that's now being posited when you invest in a women's league. So if we think back to the 90s, which was kind of the second wave around women's sports of my lifetime, the first was in the early 70s. I was born in 71. So I really was like the year before Title IX. But in that late 90s, you had the Atlanta Olympics. So you had all of the successful teams that came out of that. And then you had the 99ers who won the World Cup at the Rose Bowl, a full stadium in 1999. There were three major pro leagues for women that came out of that period. The ABL was 96. That was a women's professional basketball league. You had the WNBA in 97, and then you had WUSA after that in the early 2000s. WUSA and the ABL folded. The WNBA did not, and in part because it was partnered with a much more stable professional league in the NBA. How many times has the XFL been given a chance to get going? Women's sports back in the 90s did not have that kind of grace. Like once a women's sport, league failed, it was kind of like, oh, it's such a shame that people don't really care about women's sports, as opposed to looking at what was it about the way that business was structured? What was it about, either a lack of infrastructure or lack of long-term investment and patient capital, or, whether or not salaries were in line with what the investment structure was and how strong that was. So I think a couple of leagues failed and people got discouraged and said, well, I guess this investment space is really not going to take off. Now we're in a different time period. The WNBA is taking off, right? Like it's gotten a 30-year or a 27-year head start at this point, but in some of these current modern leagues, but it's really taking off in terms of fan base, like attention, how we know people, etc. And I think, I could go into the reasons why I think it's taking off now, but you look at the expansion teams and how much they're commanding 200 million to start a team in a new city. That's up from, what, 10, 15 million a couple of years ago, like and then you look at the revenue that's coming in from renegotiating broadcast deals, and NWSL and WNBA have certainly seen an influx of cash from that. So I think, you're looking at the marketplace. It's now recognizing the value of women's sports. it recognizes also that the people who play women's sports are influencers because they have enormous social media followings. Alona Mar, look at her. You could posit that like part of the reason that there's going to be a new pro league for rugby and there's so much excitement about that is because of force of personality and her being a known quantity. Like you know who she is, and you don't know who she is because you've been watching ESPN. You know who she is because you've been following her on TikTok or on social media in some way. So I think you're looking at a new way of understanding what the audience around these potential properties is. And then, you look at what's happened like with the PWHL. Like, I was just in Boston and like people are so excited about that. And they're getting really great crowds. And we're in year 2 for that league. So I think, there's a lot of excitement about what the markets that not everything has to be the size of the NBA or the NFL in order to be valuable. Like NASCAR is not the size of the NBA, but nobody would say we shouldn't, nobody should go to NASCAR or watch NASCAR. That it's not a valuable property. It's a valuable property, but it doesn't all have to be the monoculture, the biggest thing on the block.
With the rise of social media, is it less important for national media outlets to kind of be the end all be all when covering these new releases? Because my co-host would tell you my biggest criticism of the media coverage surrounding the WNBA is that a lot of the anchors I felt did not care when just reporting highlights. They seem pretty callous in reporting a WNBA highlight compared to other leagues. Um, it, Now that has changed, but with these new leagues taking place nowadays, I feel because of what you mentioned, social media, it doesn't really matter. ESPN matters less. They're becoming bigger personalities on social media. So, do you think, in terms of these leagues partnering with these stations and kind of the news entities, they are kind of less important in promoting the league just because social media matters more? Or do you think there's still a role for the ESPNs or kind of CBS Sports or NBC Sports or your local news broadcast and make sure they take women's sports seriously and not take it for granted just because, social media might be the number one outlet to promote these leagues?
That's such a great point. You really put that really well. I think it is the case. It's kind of like doing an end around traditional media. So let's take some of the research that was done, academic research out of Purdue, with Cheryl Cookie, who's a professor there and has been doing a longitudinal study on Sports Center kind of every couple of years, starting in the 90s. And then the last time it came out was 2019. But when you hear that 4 to 5% of your average mainstream media coverage of sports is women's sports. It's just 4 to 5%. That is the study that Cheryl Cookie and Michael Messner did. So
Wow.
you look at that, and that's coming out of Sports Center, right? That 4 to 5%. Now, Sports Center, like ESPN owned the NCAA women's tournament. It owned the WNBA, the properties for all of those years. But if 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if you turned on ESPN during March Madness, TM for the men's tournament, not the women's tournament, you would have seen highlights from a property that was owned by CBS and that was played on another network, and not so much the highlights it owned with the women's tournament. So I think, kind of it's important to have an alternative way of accessing that information, right? When you have such a stopgap, a bottleneck when it comes to reporting and women's coverage at a place like ESPN. Now, ESPN has traditionally been the absolute best in platforming women's sports, and also the worst because it's such a huge organization with so many different priorities and different people in different parts. Certainly hired a lot of women and have showcased and promoted a lot of women over the years as well. So I don't mean to, just bash ESPN. There's great and there's bad there as well. But you need to be able to have, now you don't need to go to the biggest operator in that space in order to get that information. Streaming platforms you can go to, Just Women's Sports, The Gist, you can look at Together and some of the stuff that they're doing. There are a lot of documentaries now about women's teams. So it's like, how do you get to know these players? I mean, I would argue that you wouldn't know who Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark were if it hadn't been for Sedona Prince pointing out the difference between the weight room that the women had access to, which was not a weight room, but just a little triangle of weights, and the ballroom that had been converted into a weight room for the men. Like, it's only because ESPN and the NCAA were kind of shamed into doing a better job in promoting women's basketball and platforming women's basketball. And then the next year is when Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark were juniors. You were getting to know them. And then the next year, they're on, the biggest game, and then you get to know them. But now there are other ways of getting to know people as well, and you can follow. So you find somebody, you like the way they play, you like their game, and you can go and learn more about them. Social media also demonstrates audience in a way that I think mainstream channels and networks and newspapers were not interested in finding out about. They weren't looking to identify an audience around women's sports. But, when you have Serena Williams or you have Megan Rapinoe and they have, a couple million followers, that's an audience, it's undeniable. So even though, it was tough to locate it in the past, um, in those mainstream outlets, social media has absolutely been a springboard, and I think people who consume women's sports do it a little bit differently than the way people consume men's sports. And there was a real lack of curiosity about that until social media came along and kind of said, no, 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 you're missing a market here, and a powerful one.
With the WNBA in particular, what is kind of the next step for that league to take their popularity to the next level? Because it's one of those things, especially with Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, where certainly in particular Caitlin Clark, I think she's going to be a phenomenal player, and I think she's a once in a generational talent. However, I mean it has kind of seemed, I think I'm on the side of kind of her popularity and others that are maybe new to the league, really downplaying the other players that came before her. And it just seemed like the rest of the players didn't matter, and like she was that much better when there's been there's superior players ever since the beginning of the league in the 90s. I mean, it's not like she's the first grade women's basketball player. There's been, yeah, I mean, you watch college or internationally or just anywhere, there's been a sustained flow of just great women's talented basketball players. But yeah, I just felt like with the rise of Caitlin Clark, it just seemed to kind of diminish the players that came before her. And I feel like that the WNBA, I think, played a role in that previously in not promoting their stars properly. And my worry is just, players get hurt. What if Caitlin Clark tears her ACL? We saw that with Juju Watkins. I mean, now we're not going to see her for a long time. So I'm just wondering, as a entity at the WNBA, what steps do you think they need to do to make sure they keep this positive momentum going? You're utilizing Caitlin Clark, but utilizing the new teams that they're getting, the upcoming draft classes, that's keeping that momentum going.
Yeah, so you raise a lot of really great points. I think, historical context when it comes to women's sports, and particularly the WNBA, is really lacking in coverage. Part of that is like let's say you were going to start a new magazine and you wanted to focus on the NFL. You would probably go and try to find a couple of reporters who'd covered the NFL for a really long time,
Yeah.
had great sourcing, and were going to be able to bring that expertise over to your new entity. That's not what's happening around the coverage of women's sports. When people are getting hired, it's often people who are super green and are cheap, right? The entities are not spending, like media outlets are not spending a lot of money on this. They want to get somebody who's like new and enthusiastic, and that is great. And I hope every single person who's hired to cover women's sports at that level, I hope they knock it out of the park. I really do. I never resent anybody, but you have all of these great reporters who covered women's sports for a long time who are on the sidelines. Like they haven't. Nobody's coming up to them and saying, "Hey, we really want to know more about this. We know you have a lot of contacts." They're completely discarded. I think, a lot of it has to do for social reasons, but you're losing all of that knowledge also by not caring about it as much as in the same way that you would care about another sport, a men's sport in particular, where that historical context, those contexts are very important. Um, so that's number one. So then you have, people kind of coming into the WNBA, and maybe there are some reporters who didn't care about it all that much, and they kind of got assigned to it because now all of a sudden I have to care about women's sports, and that's maybe the attitude that they come in with, and they may not have that context. They not may not understand that, you know, using a kind of brain versus brawn framing to discuss Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is deeply problematic and tied to the way that Black and white athletes have been discussed when talking about rivalries now and should be discarded as a narrative, but is somehow shown up again when it's talking about Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. I just was at a conference where somebody presented some academic work showing that the conversation around Clark and Reese was really throwback, conversation. And especially when it comes to like you come in and you don't know anything about a sport and you want to have a hot take. Well, let's talk about how these two players don't like each other. And well, Angel's got to be mad at Caitlin, or there's got to be some, when that is like not based in any sort of reporting or fact or anything like that. It's speculation based on these two players and the spotlight that one gets versus what the other gets. And a whole bunch of assumptions are made. And it's not great for Angel. It's not great for Caitlin either, because, it ends up bringing all of this kind of negativity into the space where it may or may not exist. It's projection. So you're getting projection instead of reporting. And that's, I think that's a problem as well. And, I think that, I think there are lots of issues with the WNBA and coverage going forward. I think the players are probably pretty sensitive to the way they're being talked about when it comes to some of the hot take coverage, and probably don't appreciate that very much. So, serious coverage, coverage of these athletes and who they are, getting to know people beyond Caitlin. I think if she gets hurt, I don't think that's the end of the WNBA. I think if the momentum is going way too strong. And also, Juju gets hurt. In that game in the tournament, but that doesn't mean people aren't going to tune in to see Paige Beckers and what they do, or Dawn Staley and what she's doing with South Carolina and how they do next week. I'm going down to Tampa. I could not be more excited than going down and actually seeing some of this play. So I think that's kind of where I stand with that. But yeah, I think the conversation around women's basketball in particular can be improved for sure. It's a double-sided coin, because on the flip side, when you have a lot of that frothy discussion, then it does raise awareness and interest in the sport as well. So, there, double-edged sword, I suppose.
Well, my co-host had a question on that note about having, inside the NBA is very popular, very polarizing. Is there space for a WNBA version of that show? And what comes to mind, and why I think that's a good idea, because I'm impressed by their coverage, is with Elle Duncan, Roshanae, and Araya Carter. Andrea Carter. Yeah, I think they're fantastic, honestly.
Fantastic.
Give them their own show. They can just cover the NBA, WNBA, this, both leagues, in my opinion. I think they're so underutilized on ESPN. That comes to mind to me in terms of, I know earlier there was questions of what's going to happen with Inside the NBA and just the NBA Countdown, all that coverage. I mean, you have three-year talent right there. They can do it, in my opinion.
I've been saying this for the last year. When I first saw them doing this last year, I was out. This is lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
They are so funny, and they're so in touch. They know everybody. Like they're the kind of people. They should have their own show to talk about all sports. Like they should have a weekly show, whatever. This is something that gets to me also, that there hasn't been a show. Part of what makes NBA Countdown or Inside the NFL, like all of these shows, like part of what helps stoke the interest in them is having this ongoing coverage of it. Like what's somebody doing this week, etc. We have time for profiles. We have time for sit downs. We have time for analysis. We have time for new analytics. Like whatever it is, you could put it into a show like that around the WNBA. And I agree with you. I think those three are fantastic. And ESPN has not had, there have been a number of false starts on having shows with women exclusively talking about women's sports. Like that is not a new idea at ESPN, but it has never made it to the finish line. And I actually was disappointed when this year rolled around and they were at the desk and they aren't, in some sort of situation where I know where to check in to find them again. I think you're exactly right on that. Those three deserve their own show for sure.
Yeah, they're fantastic. I want to shift, and this is something that's very close to me, and that's combat sports. And I felt that with combat sports in particularly, I know with the UFC, very controversial now, but I felt, especially with MMA in particular, within the late 2000s, really I saw a lot of the rise of women's MMA really come to the forefront way sooner than women's boxing. And then nowadays you have, Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano. They're under the Mike Tyson, Jake Paul, and now they're going to have their own fight on Netflix. I'm just curious your feelings on just women in the combat sports space, because I felt that's grown as well. Not only with just the UFC and MMA, but also boxing as well. Traditionally kind of been a lot of sexism, misogyny, but I think nowadays a huge steps have been taken forward, and now you're going to have a huge all women's boxing card on Netflix. Just curious, kind of your thoughts on the combat sports space, just in terms of just women there.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I remember I'm old enough to remember Christy Martin, when she boxed in the 80s and was kind of that anomaly, but also was a very serious fighter and like was really good. There just wasn't the quality of the field wasn't really good enough at that point because it was such a new thing. And one of the first stories that I covered was a story about a boxer named Anne Marie Saccarato, who was from Westchester County. So I kind of got into kind of that whole thinking through that. Boxing is interesting because like it's been illegal for women to box in different places, like in the UK. Like it was illegal to box up until I believe the 2000s even.
Wow.
Yeah. And and now you have, I think, Stacey Copeland's a big boxer out of there as well, and somebody who does a lot of discussion around it. I think it's what makes it possible for something like this card, like a competitive card that is drawing interest to happen, is that the conditions have to be ripe for people to feel like they can enter that sport, that they will be taken seriously, to be able to get enough money to be able to train, etc., and to be able to do it at numbers that it really creates and hones excellence at the top. And so I think kind of what you're seeing now is, you know, is that happening in a combat sports? It's unusual, there's something with combat sports that women don't often face. The first sports that women really excelled in and where there was coverage, in the 1970s were like figure skating and tennis and the feminized women's sports. Team sports even had trouble taking traction until, what you were mentioning was the late 90s. And I think, combat sports are a layer above that because they're so antithetical to what the expectations are of women in society and have been traditionally. They're very far away from that traditional role. And so I think that's been where, there's been some difficulty finding traction, since the Christy Martin era. But then, Ronda Rousey, I think, upended the whole
Yeah.
paradigm with that. And so you're kind of seeing people who were probably uh, inspired to play and to box and to get into combat sports because of her and what she was able to do, you know? Um, and then now you have kind of like it takes, I think of like Venus and Serena Williams and the space that they created for women of color in tennis and how it took probably 15 years but it completely changed um the opportunities available for women of color, but also, immigrants. And in this country, you had a number of like really good players who came from non-traditional backgrounds. And now it's like a complete, like you look at US women's tennis and it's completely different. And I feel like kind of Ronda Rousey might have had that effect also. It takes a little bit of time for those women to show up again. But I think she's probably had a big impact on what's available there.
Yeah, totally agree. Final question. What barriers and hurdles do you see on the horizon that might be uh, barriers in terms of blocking the growth of women's sports? Is it kind of the current administration, or do you think there's just so much money invested in this space in several sports internationally that it's kind of like a train that this can't be stopped, no matter what kind of hurdles that might get in the way, you think?
I think both things at the same time. I do think there are going to be hurdles that are thrown up. I mean, the conversation around trans players in sports is, I talked to Ellen Starowski, who is a professor at Ithaca College for this book, and she's brilliant. And she said, she's like, I don't think it's an accident at this moment when women are finding their footing in professional sports, and that's the dominant conversation that this kind of red herring is thrown in to the mix and that it becomes something where it takes away the shine from what's actually happening around women's sports. So I kind of, yeah, I worry about that conversation because I think some of the proposals on how to address it will end up damaging girls who want to play. If you're talking about like gender verification and how intimate and humiliating that could be, having another parent across the sideline say, I don't think that that girl is a girl. There are um, a lot of girls who get into sports who kind of grow awkwardly, or they're tall, or they're big, or they're powerful in a way that doesn't seem super feminine. And when you're like 11 and 12 and you're going through, all these changes, and what the societal expectations are, and how you don't meet up to them. And I think that's the experience for a lot of girls who play sports. And then to have something like that happen could easily throw you out of your enthusiasm for playing sports. It could really dampen that. I think, so I do worry about things like that. Like for 10 trans players at the college level, you're going to completely change and put up, gates around women's play and girls play. I worry about that. I so I also think, large scale women's professional leagues are only possible because of reproductive freedom, and the ability to choose when you want to have children. And so if something were to happen, there are conversations around whether contraception will be legal. And if something were to happen in that space, I think it would be very difficult for, women to be able to have professional careers and focus on them as much, because, that would really be an impediment in some ways, if you had no ability to control when you get pregnant. So I worry about things like that. But at the same time, we are a capitalist society. And when there is revenue being generated, and when there is interest in the amount that's coming into this space, I think that is very difficult to disrupt. So, yes, I think there are challenges ahead, but I also think that the surge is so powerful right now, and so many plans are in place and underway. Oh, the other thing I worry about is the anti-DEI sentiment. Some companies did put their investments around women's sports into the DEI category. I don't think that's necessary. I think, just from a pure economic perspective, that the spend is justified. But at the same time, I don't know how those different companies are managing their investment strategies. I would hope it doesn't impact it, but I don't feel confident that it wouldn't.
Well, Jane, thank you very much for spending some time on the show. Really appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can get the book, any other upcoming projects on the social media platforms you're involved with as well?
Yeah, so bookshop.org, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of your major sellers, the fast track inside the surging business of women's sports. Um, it's a pretty comprehensive look, but but it's also very readable. People tell me it's very readable, which is nice to hear. I hope so. Anyway, it's a great way to kind of understand the history of women's sports and how it meets the current moment, because the progress that has been made is not a given. It does not, I think if you're an 18-year-old, you think, oh, well, this is here, and so it's going to be here forever now. And it is not a given. There are things swing and ebb and flow, and the success of the 1990s didn't last as long as people had hoped. So, understanding that, though, and having your eyes open to it is the best way to be able to see when things are changing, and to be able to strategize around those forces that might end up dampening the space.
Jane, appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, Justin.